Hello, everybody. Hello to this fifth science talk that we organize together between JEDI and Falling Walls at the occasion of the Berlin Science Week. We had discussions on microplastics in the oceans, on soils, carbon sequestration. Today, we are talking about a very important topic, especially during this crisis where science showed how important it is. It's the role of foundations in supporting science and technology. And so my name is Loesekrug-Pietri. I'm running JEDI, and I'm very, very happy to have a very powerful lineup of speakers in alphabetical order. Heba Aguib, sorry for that, Heba, from the BMW Foundation and running a specific initiative within it called Recode. Is this correct? Heba? You're on mute, I think.
It's called, can you hear me? Yeah, Respond.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you are a researcher. You come from the scientific realm. I also have with us Marie Bogataj, who runs the AXA Research Fund and also Foresight within AXA. She had a career both in the public, I mean, at OECD and in the private sector with a consulting company. And so Marie, you run this fund since 2015. And last but not least, joining us from Berlin, Caroline Schmutte, who heads the Wellcome Trust in Germany. And you have a bit of similar background. You were with the other big competing consulting company, and you were also with the World Bank and running Wellcome now after having had a stint at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So as you see, it's heavy loaded. We have a lot of experience, and without further ado, what I suggest is, why don't we delve directly into topic? What do you think, each of you, is the role of foundation? What was it, and what should it be? The role of foundation in the current environment. Maybe Marie, do you want to start?
Sure, with pleasure. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very proud to be on such a great panel. So the role of foundations, well, I joined from really the private sector, and I'm still in the private sector, but now in the strategic philanthropy and scientific philanthropy piece. And what we really believe in at the AXA Research Fund, and I think this is really what we're trying to do as foundations that support science, is really show the way as responsible, and this is for the private sector at least, as responsible companies in terms of what we need to do as very important players in society, in better understanding risk, better understanding the great challenges that our societies face today, so that we can better respond to them. And so our mission is to really do this through excellent science, provide the funding for independent research, fundamental research that then feeds into R&D and innovation, and to then be able to better respond to those challenges, and to really sit next to the public sector in doing this, maybe in terms of more risk-taking, but definitely be there to be the kind of highlight all of those challenges and be there to support the effort through science and technology.
Heba, do you want to continue? And you are leading this initiative called Respond, so maybe you can tell us a few words on this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andre, for inviting me today. I really think because foundations have the flexibility, freedom, and also the responsibility to do good for the society and for the environment, it is a great chance to bring intersectorially everyone together who is contributing to solutions. And technology and science are in the core of that. Like you mentioned, I'm a scientist myself for years in the medical technology field, and now joined the foundation because it became a focus, and it's a very important one, to connect all the dots, like how to bring science, technology, innovation to solve global challenges we have in the society, and which we are facing with climate change and different challenges there. So on the one hand, it's a crucial role of foundations in bringing everyone who needs to be talking together on the table, and then also go in depth in particular projects like topics like cities. Rice Cities has been presented here in the Falling Walls conference over the past weeks, or the Respond Accelerator, tackling entrepreneurship as a topic and a connection, and important entrepreneurs and innovators, an important cohort who are developing solutions and need to be embedded and implemented in the ecosystem and empowered to do good. So going back to what the BMW Foundation is focusing on is the mindset of responsible leadership, what it means to be a leader, how you would act as someone who is anywhere, in any place, in any position, in politics, in science, in technology, in cities, anywhere, how you would act in order to make this world a better place. And as you see here, everywhere, the SDGs are the framework we are acting through, and the plan we are trying to achieve. And with the flexibility of foundations, where you said where it should go and where it is, I think there's so much more to be done to be acting freely and very conscious with solutions to tackle global challenges.
Thank you, Heba. Caroline?
Sure, happy to. And also from my side, thank you very much for inviting me to this exciting round. It's a great time to ask us this question. Wellcome Trust has actually just done a major strategy haul, which, to be honest, is the first time we're doing this in more than 80 years. We're quite an old foundation, always focused on science, always attached to that scientific mission. And we've revived our mission and vision to say we support science to solve the urgent health challenges today. And that actually shows the two aspects of where we think we as a foundation play a role. One is science in itself, and that means a strong and unwavering commitment to discovery research. So we still, especially in today's environment, there is a good reason and a need for funders to actually move at times out of pure discovery research. So the wild and open research of the things we don't know yet, where researchers are fully free to do whatever they think they need to do. We think that's a really important part of solving today's health challenges and those of the future. So we're very committed to continue to fund and support fundamental research, basic discovery research. That's the one side. But the other side is that we are free to choose our priorities, and we've decided that we will focus on what we think are three of the most important challenges to humankind, and particularly to human health over the next many decades. And those are infectious disease, mental health, and the interaction of climate change and health, particularly global warming and health. So we've just chosen that in these three areas, we are actually fully committed to fund from fundamental science up to translation. So to really actually cover the entire value chain of taking an abstract idea, in the best case, to become a product that is actually usable by everyone every day. Maybe as a last piece, the reason that I think we can do this as a foundation is three distinct things that probably most foundations can offer in a very unique way compared to other players. One is we're independent. Politically, financially, we have that independence, and we have a responsibility attached to that. Secondly, we bring a certain perspective. We as Wellcome have funded science for more than 80 years, so we feel that comes again with a responsibility and experience and a vision that we commit to. And lastly, is our relationships. We can act quite flexibly and work with everyone and anyone. And again, that gives us the possibility to really impact science.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on this focus. I mean, there's always this paradox between how can you be open, because science cannot be guided, and on the other side we have these urgent needs, and the pandemic shows us that we need to think in days and months and not anymore necessarily in years or in decades. So there's a shift in the time frame. Maybe just building on what you said, and maybe asking the same question to the others. From your experience, and you saw several foundations also on the two sides of the Atlantic, what is the complementarity? Is it just to add up to what the public sector is doing? what can foundation, I mean, you alluded to this independence, but at this critical juncture, what is the complementarity and maybe the way of working together with the public sector? Because the public sector still has this huge amounts of money that is that is deployed into science and technology. What is the connection between the two? Maybe Caroline first, and happy to go back to then Marie and Heba.
Sure. I mean, I think it depends a bit. Of course, foundations are of different sizes. In our case, Wellcome has a large endowment, similar to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which I worked before with, as you mentioned. So I think in that size, there is still a large distinction to what the public sector can play, but a specific responsibility to also live up to the ability to scale things and be in that higher, I would say, bracket of funding that can be spent. But indeed, I think the biggest difference in complementarity is the fact is that independence and the ability to take risks. Taking risks, taking big bets in cases where you decide to focus on a specific issue, where you decide to focus leap innovation, where you want to take big strides, but you don't yet know if it happens or can happen. That is something that taxpayer money isn't particularly well suited for. Most taxpayers don't want to see their tax being invested in things where you know that maybe 8 out of 10 projects are going to fail. But we need players who are able and willing to do that, who invest in something that they know matters, but they also know there will be a high rate of lack of success or of one-way streets, and to be able to fund that. So we find that 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 possibility to get ahead. That's, I think, where we can complement the public sector very well. But once we find these 1 or 2 out of 10 possibilities of something that's really promising, that has shown to be relevant to society, that's when the public sector comes in and can scale up and can help maybe mainstream into broader research, into research careers, where we as single actors and smaller actors cannot have an impact.
Marie, do you want to come? I mean, you are running a foundation which has, it's a global company, AXA, but it has deep French roots. You have a German CEO, so you are very European in your approach. How do you see the difference between the European foundation landscape and maybe the American one?
Well, first I'd like to build on what was just mentioned. Definitely one of the major advantages that we bring and how we differentiate from the public is exactly what's been described, the flexibility and the risk-taking. And in fact, when our scientific board looks at 2 very strong and equivalently strong projects, we will decide to fund with them the one that is more risk-taking, that's probably not going to be endowed, by the public sector. So I think there's a very strong complementarity, and we really believe in using our flexibility to do that. And then, as was described, it's been shown in what we've supported the public sector then takes over. I think the second thing that the foundations are able to bring, and definitely the AXA Research Fund, I also had, as you mentioned, the Foresight Group at AXA. And I think what we also see is that we can shed light on issues that are probably not yet starting to be looked at by the public sector, and that we need to push at the top of the agenda. And I think we have a big role in that too, working with the public sector into informing that decision-making on not only the existing issues, but on the coming issues. So one of these, for example, is biodiversity. AXA is going to start working much more strongly on the corporate responsibility side on biodiversity. And at the AXA Research Fund, we have been funding and are continuing to fund biodiversity-related projects. This is still not top of the agenda, and we still have people who, question what's the relationship between biodiversity and climate change. Climate change is our #1 priority. The links are so huge, and especially now with this pandemic, we're also seeing the huge links between biodiversity and health. So this is the kind of example I put forth in the complementarity that, we're shedding light on these new issues too, and we advance them, I think, much faster. In terms of your question about European and American foundations, from the European perspective, I think that link with the public sectors is probably more strong. And when I say link, I think there's much more history in terms of science being supported across the Atlantic and being translated into innovation and R&D. Much more of a history of that, but that is definitely changing also in Europe, and we are seeing more and more foundations and private sector initiatives that are starting to support science. So I'm very hopeful that this will be a trend, and that the existing foundations will persuade our other private sector network to engage in the same support.
Thank you, Marie. Heba, do you want to comment at this point, and probably also with your scientific glasses?
I'm very happy to be on the stage with Wellcome Trust, Caroline. I really acknowledge the role of such funding for free research and for innovation. The broader aspect which you mentioned, that creates solutions that then you can pick up from and have the courage to give this space is so important. I would like to highlight maybe something like the bringing together the public and private sector and foundations, etc. Like a topic like sustainability is now everyone is talking about it. Is it concerned with climate change? Is it the COVID crisis right now? Is it about poverty and water access, etc.? It's a big topic which everyone needs to be working on, and I think. I believe that there was always the mistake if you are a researcher, I'm a mechanical engineer, you work in a specific environment, there is a disconnect between the different skilled people to be working on a common solution that is really relevant for the society. This is where foundations can play a very big role, and then communicate with the corporate side, even being independent, or communicate with the public sector and say, this is a solution that makes sense. When we were, for example, at the Beyond Foundation, identified in the invest part that it's so important to transform the economic system and what role we could play. Of course, we have the freedom to talk about sustainable finance, impact investing as larger topics, and bring together players internationally who are tackling the issue, like through Coalition for Impact or very focused initiatives on the sense and the core dialogue that needs to be done, and mobilizing financial means for that. But also, in addition to this broad one, it's so important to be active on the ground, having hands-on experience. Like when we launched Respond early this year, which is an impact tech accelerator to support technologies and innovations solving societal and environmental challenges, it was the key that realization what role technology and innovation plays in society, and what role it should play, like tech for good and innovation for the benefit of society, not developing 100 different things at the same time that are not connected or not linked to society, but towards achieving a more just and sustainable society, an environment, and a balance between the economy, what the society needs, and the environmental challenges. And this is like where we have the freedom and flexibility to be active. We don't have like an supported interest for a short-term win for like in corporates, etc. But we want to highlight examples for solutions from technology, and of course scientists are behind all of these developments, and say, what, these are solutions. We need to scale them up to be tackling those challenges on the ground. And this is where also to the broader perspective, you can dive deep into solutions and highlight them and make it tangible for the different players.
So this really resonates, because what is incredible is hearing you. Actually, we talk about science and technology, and we come back to the societal challenges. We talk about climate change, biodiversity. So it's really the role of civil society that basically is funneling into these foundations. Before coming back to the foundation part, I would like to build on the point of Marie on foresight. And it's a bit also what you alluded to, Caroline, when you said that we made 3 priorities very clear: infectious diseases, mental health, and the relationship, climate and healthcare. When you, Marie, mentioned about the importance of biodiversity. Our concern here at JEDI, when we launch Grand Challenges, is to say we see increasingly that let's face it, liberal democracies driven by humanistic values are increasingly challenged on the capacity of thinking long term. And look at what's going on in this pandemic. If you run after the curve, be it for tests, for masks, or for whatever, you're always late. So how can you project yourself in a democratic environment? I mean, how do you see foundations playing that role of foresight? How do you, how do you foresight in an environment where it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks? Maybe Caroline first, a little bit on not your tricks, but how do you build this foresight capability?
Right. So I think one of the aspects I mentioned before, discovery science, one reason why we think that's still so important is because it grounds you in, some of the bigger picture thinking about what could be possible, right? When you fund discovery research, fundamental science, it is very blue sky and it feels incredibly abstract, but it gives you a sense of where this can lead to. And that's, in our view, an important part of being prepared what comes, whether it comes in 2 weeks or whether it comes in 10 years. We didn't know that CRISPR-Cut would be one of the direct applications of that research.
We seem to have
stretch scenario is now actually looking at the pandemic. In 2017, the Wellcome Trust, the government of Germany, of the UK, and Norway, and also the Gates Foundation, we jointly invested in something that is called CEPI. It's the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. That is actually a multilateral organization that was tasked to do early, almost venture capital investments in scientists who could develop a vaccine for a future pandemic. That was 2017.
The famous disease X.
Exactly. And so that was, of course, done together with the WHO. It was along sort of the global thinking of what could happen, but nobody foresaw it happening 3 years later. So had CEPI had a few more years, then I think we would have been even faster. But the fact that we now have so many vaccine candidates for the coronavirus that are in late clinical stage research is because of this foresighted investment to say we have the technology to be a bit more predictive in building vaccines. All we need is then the DNA of the actual pathogen, and then we can complete it. That was a bit of a risky bet, but not risky enough to not win government support for it, but at the same time risky enough so it needed foundation like us to sort of help build it. And now we're reaping some of the benefits of it.
Can you maybe tell us a bit more in detail who was instrumental? So you say foundations were basically leading and proposing this vision, but did then governments only bring the money, or what is the construct today?
So today I think it was actually a very, very good example of how every one of these actors plays an important role. So the vision came both from larger foundations that took part in it. It came from the scientists that were working on what we call the platform vaccine technology. So the idea that you can essentially build part of a vaccine without actually knowing what it might be for, and understanding a little bit what that could mean and how that could be prepared, even if you don't know yet which pathogen you might use it for. That came pretty much from science. But very early on, there were several governments who were committed to science, committed to global health, and said, that's exactly what we need. And I think it would have been impossible without early political will behind this. And this came from Germany, it came from Norway, and it came from the UK, particularly those three. Many governments now have joined the initiative. And it was at a time where, for example, the Germans put epidemic preparedness on the G7 agenda and on the G20 agenda, which wasn't kind of not a usual thing to put on these kind of agendas. So you needed both. You need the political will to make it happen. But you also, of course, we tried as a foundation to sort of work in the background to fill it with possibilities, with content, to understand what you need.
So I think we are losing you, Caroline. Maybe the connection is not that good. Marie, do you want to pick up on the foresight and then maybe also comment maybe on this preparedness aspect?
Sure. First of all, we're very thankful for CEPI, because I do believe that, that really did give us a head start into this pandemic. In terms of foresight, so coming from the insurance industry, of course, given the industry that's based on future risks, basically that's what you take out an insurance against. This is a major part of our thinking. And so every year the company puts out a report, a future risk report, based on polling of experts, academics, the general public, business leaders. And that is one of the dimensions of what we look at in, let's say, the medium-term risks that are emerging. We also, as Caroline said, reach out to our academics, and that is a very, very valuable community into informing what the next issues are going to be. Yes, it is fundamental, but in that fundamental basic research, there is so much information that is in the lab that we work with the academics to better understand, to know where our dial should be in the following years in terms of support. And I think we have a real role to play also into taking this information out of the lab, out of the expertise, and sharing it with the public sector for them also to move forward. So I have a few people working on my foresight team, and what they look at is those two parts of expertise and academia, and then looking at weak signals that are out there that you feel have a potential to actually have an impact in 10, 20, even 50 years from now, and to look at how that can change society in a way where we need to respond, both as a foundation, but also as a private sector player, as an insurer. And that team really works on determining, out of those possible futures, which of them are most probable and which ones we should delve into a further screening of and a further understanding of. And it's very complementary to the work that we do at the AXA Research Fund in terms of selecting the next big subjects and big areas where we support the research.
May I push you a little bit on that? Because on one side, you're talking about weak signals, but we must have weak signals on many, many, many areas. And then on the other side, and you mentioned it very eloquently, as well as Caroline, then it's a question of priorities. And it's funny because we have this debate all the time. People ask us, are you top down? Are you bottom up? We really believe that it needs to be a combination of two. If you are too streamlined in this exponential world, you're missing the target. But if you don't prioritize, you are spreading too thin, and you are not prepared when it comes. So, tell us how then it's decided. Is it a visionary leader? And then I'll come to Heba. How do we train leaders to have this capacity of foresight? And tell us a bit the magic sauce of AXA Foresight, if you have one, or if you want to share it.
Sure. So no, it's definitely, as you said, a mix of bottom up and top down. And I described this survey that we do on an annual basis that really provides kind of the feel on the ground of decision makers around the world about what are the future risks. So interestingly enough, just to share a little piece of this, last year, number 1, climate change, number 2, cyber, number 3, pandemics. This year, of course, pandemics number 1, it was kind of down there, but so of course there's a shift and change, and so then that signal is not weak. It's very linked to the current situation. So we need to work with what we see as all those weak signals to kind of look at what will emerge, what we believe will emerge. And yes, we do talk to our leaders also, who are plugged into to networks of leaders also, and who kind of give us their push and their view and vision on what to focus on. So, we spoke about biodiversity. What we're seeing here, it's also a constancy of the issues that are coming up over the years. So pandemics was always there, but it was once in a 100-year event. and it wasn't so immediate, and so in the view of people who were responding on this future risk report that we developed, it was kind of there, but not yet at the top. In the same way, what we're seeing today is cyber, and we believe, looking at those weak signals and also looking at the issues today that are developing even within this crisis, that is probably within the one or two major issues that we will have to address across the board: the impact on health, the impact on climate, the impact on the economy through cyber. So it's really top down and bottom up, as you mentioned, and yes, the vision of our leaders also.
Maybe Heba, and before going to you, I mean, first I want to thank especially Marie, because today is a holiday actually in France, so that goes against the traditional image of France. So thank you, Marie, to be there. And apparently there's a lot of interest, because on the different streaming there is almost 180 people watching. So thank you, and many questions. But Heba, could you tell us how can responsible leaders, or can leaders that have really foresight, vista, would we say, can that be trained?
It's training is so let's start. I have so many comments on what have been said, and I will start with the leadership issue. So responsible leadership is a mindset and a value system. Like what does it mean for you to be responsible? How do you feel towards the environment? What is your responsibility towards yourself and your own journey? Like this is something very important, and to your teams, to bringing solutions to the ground, to doing what is needed to implement the change needed. And yes, this can be inspired, this can be empowered. When I look to our network, which I was member of before joining the foundation here 1.5 years ago, it's a network of 2,000 responsible leaders actively contributing to change, and the inspiration of coming together, like again, I was leading a research department for heart disease research in Egypt for biomedical engineering research, and I came through the foundation to coming together with a lot of people doing different things in different institutions, and reflecting on the challenges you have, taking that responsibility to offer people a better healthcare solutions, etc. It brings a lot of coming together and exchanging the experience, but a lot of also beside the peer-to-peer, etc. exchange. What should you do in times of crisis? How can you implement the right mindset in your teams, etc.? And this is something we have, for example, in the in our formats of the foundation, responsible leader gatherings, etc. And in the Respond Accelerator, because you see, yes, a lot of entrepreneurs and technologists and innovators need this access to know and be strengthened and supported in their approach and decision to take it. It needs a lot to take the solutions further. It needs boldness. It needs people to dare to do things, and you cannot be alone. You need a network, you need a connection and a support. I would like to go back to some points in brief. I know the time is very limited. Going to the European question, like tomorrow we'll bring out a Tech for Good report about challenges and solutions for global challenges, and really, it's a call to check it out tomorrow. It's going to be really interesting, with different views of investors and innovators and entrepreneurs and EU commissioners on what is needed to bring Europe and solutions globally further, because it's clear how high-ranked European universities and institutions are in terms of research, but there is so much to be done in order to bring these into practice, to scale them up, and to be competitive, knowing that there are so many different value systems around the world supporting success. So this is something that really needs to be looked deeper into. When a lot of the long-term, mid-term, and short-term solutions, there are so many needs that are known. There needs to be a will and the leadership to implement solutions that are there, and no one is taking like the initiative saying, okay, let's solve I take the medical as an example because we're here surrounded by medical technologies, etc., and experts. Let's solve cardiovascular disease issues that can be solved tomorrow. How can you support researchers and innovators on the ground in Africa, in different places, to have this interaction and to really bring everyone on board, like who is already developing solutions? I think the pace from seeing that there is a problem until starting to implement it on the ground is too slow. And now with the COVID challenge and with the climate crisis being now prioritized, we see how much needs to be done in 10 years and in 15 years, but there's so much that we can do ahead and take into consideration listening to everyone who's vocal about a need. And this is something that needs to be considered by investors, by the financial systems. Are we going to invest short-term for short-term success and turnover? Is it going to be a strategy? What is sustainable and what is just like following a trend? I'll stop here. I have a lot to say, but I'm going to stop here.
We are very happy to continue, but I think we tried to keep the format relatively short. But building on Heba's comment, and you mentioned that, Caroline, before, you talked about speed, what foundation can maybe bring that is different. But then you also mentioned that CEPI could have had a bit more time. I mean, we all saw this image, of the waves. I mean, we have currently the COVID-19 wave, but the climate change wave is probably much, much bigger. What has changed in our mindsets, be it at foundation or at government level? Are you optimistic we learn something about this preparedness attitude? And please let's be really very honest here. Do we have the impression that we will come out of this crisis hopefully soon better prepared for future challenges? And what can foundations bring to the table?
I am optimistic, and I think we at Wellcome are cautiously optimistic, first in terms of the pace in which we will emerge out of this crisis. I think we all know that this is likely not going to be just 100 years until the next time it may happen. These kind of pathogens that the coronavirus is part of seem to be emerging much more often over the last 10 to 20 years.
You also see the link with,
I think it's
with
not
biodiversity, or among others?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think there's a link when you talk about these so-called zoonotic diseases that come from animals and somehow make it over to humans. It certainly has to do with how humankind interacts with the environment in many shapes and forms. So absolutely, yes. But I think, and I hope, the two things that we will have learned from this is, number one, that these preemptive investments, whether it's CEPI or other forms, are not only critically important, but they're better when they're done multilateral. So I think this idea that we need to be willing and more willing to invest jointly in a pot or an organization that we think makes sense. There's a history of science projects carrying some sort of flag, or government-funded projects. It needs to show this flag and that, and it needs to be our baby. Part of that is fine. But it's really important to be willing to give that up at times and really invest multilaterally, and particularly in global challenges. Nobody's going to solve climate change locked into one country. And sadly, we're also not solving this pandemic if one country has all of the vaccines stocked up in their own depot. We will only solve it if we act together, both in science and in turning science into a product and into a solution. And I think that's what I hope needs to be the biggest lesson learned, particularly for governments, because they have a naturally politically driven interest in making things look more national than they need to be. And that's, I hope, where we foundations can help to create more and more examples, to facilitate, to use our convening and policy power, so to speak, to bring it on a more multilateral road.
My hope, and it's definitely realized, is that with such with a 100% female panel, we would have a much more straight talk. And so thank you. But let me then push you a little bit more on the unpolitically correctness, because what you say is, I mean, we all hope for that. The first reaction all over the world, and even in Europe, for something as small And of course, as important as masks was exactly the opposite. So we closed borders, everybody looked at itself. And I mean, what would be the nudges for multilateral approach? What needs to change from a political mindset, or maybe on the incentives of everybody, and that this true multilateral approach is put in place? Because first reactions is like first impressions are unfortunately the most important. And I'm a dear European. I don't think Europe came out greater out of that pandemic. Let's face it. It's just a fact. But you may have another opinion on this.
Just briefly on this, I mean, I do think there are aspects that show Europe in a strong light. So, for example, it was the European Union and has been European governments who have actually started the multilateral funding process to invest in drugs and in vaccines to make them globally accessible. It was Ursula von der Leyen early in May who called for a first donor conference. It's kind of the tools that politicians have. The beginning of these crises, I think they were used predominantly by European governments, and we're very thankful for that. That's a bit also due to geopolitics at the current times, of course. That's the one part. I think the other part that is important to keep in mind is that it is easier to invest multilaterally before the crisis. Prevention is something that isn't very sexy to talk about. It doesn't cover current events, luckily, that's the point of it. But that's when we can put our money and our knowledge and our activities together and create the CEPIs or the Green Climate Funds or whatever it needs to take and come together. It is much harder to do that during a crisis when every politician is asked to make decisions in ambiguity, where scientists may change their opinion next week because we learned something new about the disease, and suddenly it becomes all messy. So hopefully, while we're not actively in a crisis, or we feel the crisis takes long enough, case in point, climate change, that we can still prepare, that needs to be the prime time for multilateralism.
No, absolutely. And my point was more about member states rather than the EU. But I will come back to that. But maybe, Marie, how do we make prevention sexy?
So I think the current crisis really shows that prevention should be sexy, because then it all becomes unsexy, as we were just talking about. When you're in the crisis, you don't react as rationally as you can before. And one of the extra elements there is, of course, public opinion. Let's preserve our people. There are quite, just to build on what Caroline was saying, other examples though of cooperation that did happen. In the beginning, at least in France, when we were having issues with treating people in hospitals, the other European countries did take in a number of critically ill people. So I think that there are multiple dimensions on which the cooperation was actually happening. I think the fear and just not understanding the virus and not knowing how it was transmitted at all, I think exactly all of that just made everything kind of freeze, including probably what could have been stronger cooperation. So that's on the prevention part. I think looking at the actual reality of what the next crises could bring about should really make governments and other investors, private investors in science and understanding risk, react better. And you were talking about how optimistic are we? So at some point at the beginning of this crisis, when we were all locked in, there was this huge hope that as individuals, not only as public players, but as individuals, we would change. We would start caring about the environment all of a sudden, and be digitally more savvy, and in fact, when you go out now, people are still the individuals that they were. Maybe some things have changed in their behavior, but not radically. And what I kind of fear for the future, to be perfectly honest, is the competing challenges, because of course they eat up the investment or the financial support. And so I think we have a role in showing the interdependence of these challenges: climate change, health, socioeconomic issues. And I think this was the the perfect storm. Nobody could have imagined, even if you had a health crisis, that it would actually impact our socioeconomic environment so strongly with lockdown. Nobody would have imagined that all of these businesses would just go bankrupt, have to shut down. So I think the interdependencies that have been apparent now might be the sign that we really have to act on multiple fronts, not to consider the challenging issues that we face as competing, and to have a common ground and a common initiative around solving them, or at least mitigating them and being resilient.
Thank you so much. There are many questions. Maybe let's tap a few and go a bit beyond the agreed time, if all three of you are fine. But just for a couple of minutes. The first one is about a comment that was made by Caroline early on between discovery research and more translational research. When you fund programs, I mean, there is always this debate among the research community. Yes, we want funding, but we don't want it to be mercantilized. I mean, that it immediately translate into, and it has some ground, because today, if you only look for the current science, the risk is that you are very quickly late. And from a European perspective, we are convinced that we need to think about the next big thing. That's much more positive thinking. How do you combine that? How do you make sure that there is a clear goal, but on the other side that you leave open all the opportunities? And how do you measure that? Because when you fund programs, I guess you're also looking at the impact that you can have.
Absolutely. It's an important question, and I think we as Wellcome and many other foundations are still experimenting and learning, particularly on measuring outcomes.
Wow, what we have done years, so that means that there's a steep learning curve for all of us. Absolutely.
What we have done in this new strategy is acknowledge that divide quite explicitly, and so we have decided we will fund fundamental curiosity-driven research as a good, as what it is, when it, in Wellcome's case, as it relates to human health. And we will do this actually in a much more interdisciplinary way. So we go almost broader in who we fund for discovery research. Translational research, we will encourage within these three health challenges, because there our mission is to actually get from fundamental research to a product, to a solution. And that's where we will be much more encouraging of ourselves of translational research. What we do think is impossible in both is important in both cases is that scientists who at least in their work get close to an application or do work where a pragmatic application is more sort of an afterthought or maybe a coincidence, which is also happening in much of the fundamental research, is that we as a funder help maybe not just in financial terms, but more through connections, through mentoring, through convenings, to at least ensure that translation is within the mindset and within the radar of scientists as they do their work. It doesn't have to be part of the funding scheme, but it needs to be sort of part of the overall thinking where it applies. And sometimes that means that other people actually end up doing the translation, or something gets passed on to a biotech or a private equity fund or whatever it takes. But at least that it's not always or not sometimes an afterthought.
There is another question that I think I would direct to Marie, which is about infrastructures. I mean, some research infrastructure are essential for science, asks Arnaud. And I would add to that, to what Caroline said about how can we increase multilateral approach. And you mentioned that too, Marie. Can foundations also support that? I mean, people think about CERN and ITER and all these multilateral projects, which actually are the perfect nudge for cooperation. Is it outside of what foundation can and should do?
Very interesting, because you didn't mention it. We also, we constantly go through strategic review, actually. But this year, that was exactly the discussion, and the reason of that discussion was we have this excellent science. How do we disseminate it in the best way possible so that there could be applicability, but also to inform on the challenges? But further than that, how do we really plug into public and private decision-making better? There are a number of organizations today that is really their role. They're science-based, they're global, and they're very well connected to public decision making, and could probably be even more so with players such as us around them. So we are moving forward on putting aside part of our funding, not the major part, but a part of our funding to actually support those infrastructures, those partners that are based on global science and interdisciplinary way over one research area, and that come together and that have a role to play within that realm. So absolutely, it's pretty novel, because we were really pretty traditional in the way we supported science, but definitely that is key, I think, to advancing it and to helping the environment as a whole go faster in terms of research and solutions to the challenges.
There's another question that will make you three also think is, we hear interdisciplinarity, we hear leadership, we hear financing, we hear foresight. These are all the characteristic of what political organizations should be, or ideally. How much have foundations almost a political role to play? We saw this complex interaction between science and the political realm. Some countries have a scientific committee for the pandemic. Some shut it down completely. That is apparently changing currently in the US as we speak. Some actually have scientists at the helm of their, and we think obviously of Germany, but not only. Tell us about the interaction of in this technological or scientific century, as you may say. I don't know, Heba or Caroline.
I can start. I think the networking issue, like bringing those together who needs to be talking, is a very important point, which has been brought here. Like the foundations can be offering this network connectivity on a neutral ground where the interest is for the people, and this is a different conversation than when you have very particular political interest here and there, etc. So it's our role to bring politicians with scientists, etc., to talk. I also think I would like to highlight something which is related to the corona crisis and all of that. The trust building in society is a very important point. Like what has been done until now is a lot of technologies being developed and not being communicated properly with the people. So even wireless payment is taking so much long, so much in time in Germany, etc. So how to integrate people and society in terms of being competent to having this competence building thing, which you need as an employee, which you need as a society to be coping with technology, which you need in all levels of society in order to converge solutions and use solutions. This is a very important, or technologies. This is an important point. Again, to the making it sexy, or I think the crisis has shown that innovative infrastructures and teams which are flexible and know what they do and how to be creative and create solutions are those who are good in innovation, but are also those who are good in innovation in crisis and dealing with crises. So I think we need to invest even more in people, to be honest, so that they can deal with short-term situations. I mean, in Europe, it was so shaking. In a lot of other countries, I don't know, in revolution times or different times, you have the same challenges every day. The problem with not going out of the street was urging here in the corona times, but not being able to go to work is a global challenge for so many people on a daily level. So I think this needs to bring us to think again on how to empower people even more and this is something that we can focus on as foundations to take the society to another level, combined with the leadership aspect, etc.
Marie, Caroline?
Yeah, I would definitely underline the trust building part. I think that's a really, really important one, especially in these times where we as science funders have an obligation to explain to society why science doesn't give you unwavering facts, especially when you don't know much yet. I think it has just proven politicians are under pressure to decide if your kids can go to school tomorrow, and that's a pressure that they need to live with. That's their job. But therefore, they need to make decisions at a time where it would be so convenient if the right study could tell you just right now if kids should be going to school or not and how contagious they are. And sometimes we just don't know yet, or we find out 2 weeks later that actually what we thought 2 weeks ago isn't quite right. And I think explaining that to the public and explaining what science is good for, how it works, why, especially in the very current environment, it doesn't serve everyone's purpose at all times, is a really important role that foundations can play, because that's simply not the job of politicians. And it is also not always the job of a scientist, because the scientist's job in the end is first and foremost to do the science that we are all talking about, right? And so I think there's, especially in crises, there's an important role for foundations to support trust building and the right communication. And also, as Heba said earlier, I think promoting the survival, to say it a bit dramatically, of the values that we all cherish behind science, so that science actually matters, that the right information matters, that hijacking this crisis or other crises for personal purposes, which is unfortunately happening in this crisis quite a lot, and has been in previous crises. I think being clear what the facts are and where they're simply not true. These are things that we as foundations can support, supporting organizations that do that work, standing behind our own research and our priorities. And as the last part, I'd say we are also quite impactful in creating career paths for the next generation to bring us the scientists that we need. I mean, in the end, it's the big public science system that makes it work, but pointing to the careers that maybe currently aren't so sought or that aren't accessible for everyone, not for every aspect of stratum of society, ensuring that research is done exclusive, that medical trials, for example, are done with an inclusive mindset. These are things that we can foster.
It's very interesting what you say. I mean, before we go, we unfortunately are running out of time. But before I give the word also to Marie, maybe the two last points that we could elaborate through a final round is, I wanted to ask you, where do you think are the blind spots? I mean, and where you think we should do more and we could do more as foundations. And the other point that you just alluded to is, we saw how many scientists actually became also very well known to the public, also because of their reassuring figure. I mean, we can talk about Dr. Fauci, I mean, without naming only a few, but we think about Dr. Fauci in the US, or Drosten in Germany, or a bit the head of the scientific committee in France, and there are probably many others in the world. So actually a scientist also mean turning into a big communicator, a question mark, and how much, or should foundation promote that too? Comes back to the leadership question. But maybe before, Marie, you wanted also to react before we do a final round?
Sure, kind of it links into your question anyway. So I think, Caroline, that was extremely, that was a great way to put it. I think, not expecting science to deliver right away, and it's not unwavering. It is research, it is science, it takes time. There are different hypotheses, there are different, paths. And I think what underscores, the importance of what we're doing, and what the general public and decision makers have to understand, is that we need to respect the independence of science. And it's only listening to the different the different projects and the different findings, and respecting that independence, that we can then, kind of take a step back and conclude on the next way forward in the best possible way, of course, given the emergency of the current crisis. So I think I wanted to really underline, the importance of independence of the research, going back to the question about, the political issues, André. And then maybe I could just segue into your final questions. So communication, definitely. I mean, this was something that I think was very new to not all, but quite a few of the experts that, and this goes with the 24-hour news cycle, of course, that were present, that everybody was, waiting to listen to. And the communication, the dissemination part is huge. So we actually have a program where we train our younger junior scientists into how to use social media, how to translate their research into a press article, how to speak to journalists, and really that's a key mission also of foundations, if they can allocate resources to that. It's to how we really get messages across. That's key to us.
Heba, you want to build on this?
Yeah, I would like to say 2 points. I think it's time to create new platforms where the conversation can take place, where people like what Karin mentioned, for example, scientists who do not have the role and the competencies to explain themselves. You need translators and people to be listening to each other. And I'm really not talking about the soft part of things, but like really coming to very concrete topics and say who needs to be listening and co-creating together and find solutions. And this brings us, so this is about the platforms and a lot of formats we are doing in the foundation is like how to bring all stakeholders together in this room to talk, or how to have an integrative process. And talking about process, this is the second point, which I think we need to focus on. We really need to have more integrative, like integrated processes. We need a lot this process innovation thing where it's not like scientists do this, then companies take the science and do this, and then the people are informed about the solution, and then they need to be on board and politicians support. I feel like this needs to be fundamentally changed. And during the crisis, we've seen the Vir versus Virus initiative, which brought a lot of new ideas and was an example reported in the US and everywhere around the world, where it was an out-of-the-box solution where society, economy, corporates, foundations were all on board to solve this issue. And let's take this outside of the crisis times and have it as a as a normal way to innovate and to live together. I think we can learn a lot from what happened. And going to the optimism, I'm very optimistic about that. But a lot of daring needs to be done to create new processes and break the silos.
Breaking the next wall to break,
breaking the wall,
which is the motto of Falling Walls. Absolutely. And I want to mention at this point, before maybe leaving the final word to Caroline, even if we are completely focused at JEDI on these grand challenges, we will probably start in the next weeks. We're very concerned about the increased distance. On one side, you have these figures, and on the other side, you have increased sometimes skepticism in part of the population. Think about GMOs, think about nuclear, think about vaccines. I mean, in France, recent polls showed, that's probably France exception, that only 58% of people would like to be vaccinated if there's a COVID. I mean, which shows that there is, and in the US, we have the same kind of distance. So we need to have conversations where on one side there is the science, as you said, Caroline, the science and what it knows and what it does not know, and on the other side, what are the societal impacts? And too often knowledge is mixed with opinions, and that's where we have a complicated conversation. Caroline, the last word on maybe the blind spots also.
Sure. So I think, I would underline everything that's been said on communication. I think this crisis shows us just how important it is to communicate science well. And there is part of that we can support as foundations for scientists we fund and equip them with skills. I think there's a part around how media have capacity to deal with science. In the everyday media industry, obviously, profits are going down, and science departments and science journalism isn't exactly the most important thing to be held up. And now we're at a time where actually the pandemic is so, headline, that it's not really the scientists, journalists that are writing these headlines. It's of course others. So there's a whole power dynamic within traditional media that, I don't know who's supposed to influence that. I actually don't think foundations can necessarily and shouldn't control that. But I think it's something that, particularly where governments fund state media, state TV channels and so on, they have a particular responsibility to maybe counterbalance some of the politics and incentives that happen within media. There's a huge role for experimenting with social media and other forms of media to communicate particularly to younger people. I think we've lost many on the way when it's just sort of the establishment that talks about the pandemic. And also because different types of media have a different ability to just access, broad parts of the society that maybe your everyday very educated newspaper in whichever country may not reach everyone to do that. And I think as a last part, as a blind spot, what I think maybe we can do through our policy functions that foundations often have is also acknowledge that we want politicians and decision makers to make decisions based on facts and figures, but that is hard when these aren't fully established. And I think if there are ways to also not just provide decision makers with the facts and figures and expertise that we all have, which I'm sure we're doing, but thinking a little bit about how can there be more awareness and ability to speak to ambiguity. That's just part of the job as a politician and as a decision maker, and to be clear what we know today and what we don't know, and that we still need to make a decision. I think being able to communicating in uncertainties in a way that's not just driven entirely through political appearance, but also really trying to calm down a society that is worried, whether it's politicians, whether it's communicators, whether it's stars in TV or in social media. I think that would be a skill that we need more of.
Caroline, that is an amazing final conclusion. I mean, I hear that we should all become, and we are all becoming, daily readers of bioRxiv. So that becomes mainstream newspapers. And I mean, I cannot summarize every great things which have been said by Marie, by Heba, and by yourself, Caroline. But I think the importance of foresight and probably the final word on and that goes into what Marie and Heba said about leadership and communication. I mean, how do you manage and communicate an uncertainty, build on the facts and move forward with that and be very transparent at that. I mean, thank you so much. It's an amazing final of our science talks and for us of the Berlin Science Week. I want to thank you, Marie Bogataj from AXA Research Fund, Caroline Schmutte from Wellcome Trust, and Heba Aguib from the BMW Foundation. Thank you so much. And clearly, it's the time of women leadership has really begun. So I think that was very clear today. Thank you to all three of you.
Thank you.